On this episode, we look back at some of humanity's unsolved mysteries.
Cases that have remained unsolved. Or is it really? We expose you to the killings that took place in the Whitechapel neighborhood in 1888.
Caused by the well-known serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, who was actually named by the locals in the Whitechapel district. And sees this, Ishan, all the killing committed within that time period were within a mile of each other, in the east end of London, near the Whitechapel neighborhood.
That is indeed insane. There are several suggestions as to who the major suspect may have been. There were hundreds of them surrounding the single case, even pointing to renowned figures like Victorian painter Walter Sickert and even Queen Victoria's grandson.
Even just hearing a gist of this case has made my head spin.
It certainly does, Harteg. If you're listening to this right now and you're ready to put on your detective hat, I'm sure you're not going to want to miss this episode.
Grab a food, a drink, or both and settle in. Those of you who are new to our podcast, welcome. Stay tuned and sit back while we examine this case.
Good morning
Afternoon.
and evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ishan,
And my name is Harteg.
and welcome back to Unsolved Mysteries. Hello there, detectives, and welcome back to our podcast. If you're new here, welcome and be warned.
There will be a lot of research going on in this episode, so grab your magnifying glass and let's solve this case.
We will look at the following to get a sense of what we will be doing in this show. What were the victims' identities? And where were they murdered?
Who was involved in the investigation?
Prime suspects, as well as any form of proof to show why they were on the top of the list. What type of motivations did the murderer have?
Everything begins on August 7, 1888. Ishan, do you know why this day was so significant? Because this was the first murder committed by the infamous Jack the Ripper.
Wow! It's hard to believe that this case happened 134 years ago. Imagine if we had been this evolved back then. But I'm also interested to how the serial killer came to be known as Jack the Ripper.
That was really from one of the letters sent to the Metropolitan Police Station by the infamous murderer who signed his name as Saucy Jack. The letter discussed was him talking about how the cops claimed to have caught him and how they were utterly off the mark.
He went straight for the dagger. What a bold approach to confront your enemy. Do you believe it may, nevertheless, have been forged?
It does mention that it was most likely written by a journalist, but this is the only piece of evidence we have of this case.
So let's travel back to the year 1888, Victorian England. Queen Victoria, the woman who redefined the English monarchy, had ruled over 50 years in royal England. However, this is far from where the story takes place. Whitechapel, part of the London area known as the East End. Whatever the darkest terror in your hidden childhood, the nightmares could have never compared to the day-to-day reality of this neighborhood. Unbearable poverty, rampant crime, and the host of deadly diseases. The East End slums were more like hell on earth, and the winter wasn't as warm as the tired baby. Infant fatigue rate was staggering. 55% of children died before the age of 5.
Not a good place to live in, I suppose, just judging by what you said there, Ishan. Life was literally a daily battle for survival, and the streets were unbearably wet, cold, noisy, and full of insidious threats. With the cops only venturing down the streets in groups, no less than 3 people at a time, it was simply too dangerous. The women had to become quite tough and ruthless to adapt to the violence that came their way. In fact, the vast majority, if not all, carried guns and knives at night.
You got that right, Harteg. There was also an influx of Jewish immigrants to the area. A trend of racism and discrimination began, unfortunately. as many British locals feared foreigners, but also had a grudge towards them. Also, at the time in English society, they believed that Jewish immigrants were less accepting for jobs that took advantage of all opportunities of English neighbors. The result was no matter who it was, native or immigrant, life was pretty miserable. And that was before the unbridled psychopaths terrorized the streets of the Whitechapel.
Let's go on to the victims. I'll give you a quick account on who the man murdered, and I'll let you decide what they all had in common, Ishan. Between 1888 and 1891, 11 women were killed. 5 women, however, were verified to have been slain by Jack himself. Let's begin with the first victim, Mary N. Nichols, who was murdered on September 8, 1888. Then Jack committed a double homicide on September 30. Finally, the last footprint left on this case was on November 9, 1888.
Thank you, Harteg. Let us now look at what each victim had in common. Now, I'm not going to go into each person's life and what brought them to this point. However, let's just state the obvious. All 5 of these murders occurred in the same year. This clearly indicates that it may have been the same individual, considering that there were only 11 killings in those 3 years, as he stated. Coincidence? I don't think so. Another thing I also wanted to point out was that they were all prostitutes. 4 of them were previously married, and they were all struggling financially.
That's fantastic, Ishan. But before we veer off, let's have a look at who was behind this case. Right, in this occasion, the leader and investigator was Inspector Edmund Reed. His idea, what happened in all 5 killings, was that it may have been prepared by a local alcoholic in the neighborhood who had no remembrance the next day. I do realize that the east part of the Whitechapel was extremely dangerous back then. But to have this happen 5 times, I just couldn't put my fingers on it.
Dr. Kim Rosmo, who used to work for the Canadian Police Force, led this digital age of investigation and came up with the conclusion. Here's a direct quote from him. "I would be very surprised if the Ripper hadn't been involved with the Flower and Dean Street. He could have lived there, drunk there, picked up prostitutes there. He might even had a relative there with a high probability that he was within the activity area."
Assuming Jack was actually from the East End, how would it affect him emotionally and psychologically? If he witnessed firsthand daily struggles such as poverty, disease, crime, or let's face it, utter hopelessness, it could lead to a strong desire for a better life. It could mean desire for more money and more comfortable living conditions, more opportunities. That dissatisfaction that starts as a carving for something you don't have roots into anger and resentment.
When you don't have outlets for those emotions like drinking or fighting, or even positive outlets like art or writing, he may have braved all that anger and accumulation in its most violent form. Murder, brutal, and almost savage. That could have also possibly been his motive, as there was no other connections that could link all 5 women to the same man. Aside from that though, now it's time for what we all have been waiting for. Who could the prime suspect be? What are the theories so far, Harteg?
Considering this place is so atrocious, I wonder, Ishan, what was the psychological impact of this value? I mean, maybe Jack was a product of this environment, acting only in response to it? It's very possible, but then we have to assume that we're not sure if Jack emerged from the environment. We're not even sure if he even lived on the East End, and there are theories that Jack was actually an upper-class citizen who lived outside of Whitechapel, but he went there to trap his victims more easily in the slums where the police was lax and were basically a free criminal for all.
Yes, but there is also a theory that he lived very close to the scene of the murders, as each of them took 1 mile apart from each other. However, in recent years, crime experts have used computer algorithms and geographic profiles to attempt to locate Jack the Ripper's house.
Wow, so now they can do that too?
Apparently, yes. They used Jack's time in the East End to speculate that he lived on Flower and Dean Street in the middle of the Whitechapel slum. It's incredible how advanced forensic technology has gotten.
We can't actually ignore the fact that newspapers circulating has referred for some time now that this is one of the most terrifying crime areas, and there has not been much relief yet. As you mentioned earlier, that drinking and fighting were daily rituals of East End.
Just like your local Tim Hortons and McDonald's, countless local pubs started out on street corners, offering cold beer and cheap gin.
People often squandered what little money they had on this stiff-necked.
The more people drank, the more their tensions and aspirations surfaced, manifesting themselves in constant violence, and there was little comfort aside from these threats. Most residences did not really own or rent real estate.
What exactly is going on anymore? Where in the world did people sleep or do normal things like we do at home?
They rented beds, buildings known as housing, or 2 houses that lined the streets. They offered 2 single beds for sleeping, making murders easy to execute and get away with.
Despite having a difficult time locating someone in this case, since technology in late 1800s was not as advanced as it is now. However, the closest match we were able to find was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who immigrated to Whitechapel in the 1880s.
And to be honest, I am a part of that group since Aaron was no stranger to violence, having threatened his sister with a knife and being sent to an asylum in 1891. Yes, he could have still killed all 5 victims before then. However, I'm doubtful to what his motivation may have been. Could it be that he had no remembrance of these killings night after night due to intoxication? Honestly, I have no idea. This has made me quite skeptical.
I totally agree with you, Ishan. There were hundreds of suspects pointed to this case with various motives, so we cannot assume this case. However, that is the closest guy we can find because there is direct evidence that he was related to one of the victims.
That is correct. To basically review what we have mentioned in this podcast, we have mentioned the different topics and elements of victims, motives, evidence, suspects, and the case in general. Whew, that was an incredible case.
It truly was.
If you're still watching this, we'd like to thank you. Oh, and if you're a new listener who enjoyed this episode,
I'm sure you'll enjoy the rest of our investigation series.
please consider subscribing to receive new daily content. You won't regret it. My name is Ishan.
And this is Thursday,
And stay tuned for more on Unsolved Mysteries.